Well, Gary, thank you for spending the time today with us and sharing the information about the suicide prevention with the VA in Durham and what you do. Uh, First of all, how did you get involved with counseling and with the suicide prevention side of things? What made you decide to go that route?
I'm often asked that question, how did I wind up where I am today? It wasn't my intention at all. If you would have asked me 30 years ago if I would be a social worker working for the Department of Veterans Affairs, I would just say, I don't have the personality for that. I don't think that I'm capable of doing that. But I had some life experiences before I was in the Marine Corps, while I was in the Marine Corps, after the Marine Corps, where I saw people who were affected by trauma, combat trauma, and deeply affected. And I would listen to their stories of war. My senior drill instructor was a Vietnam combat vet, and he would tell us what it was like being a machine gunner in Vietnam, and that the importance of the training was to be able to survive that ordeal and come back alive, accomplish the mission, come back safely. And I started thinking about my stepfather, who was also in the Marine Corps, and he would tell me stories about the Chosin Reservoir. He was wounded there. I had cousins and uncles who were also in the military, and I just started to get interested in that whole experience, that whole veterans experience, and how it changes people, how it changes their values, how it changes their personalities. And while going through the Marine Corps, I noticed that there were certain people who did better than others, who had similar experiences. And I was always kind of curious, well, why is that? Why is it that two Marines could go through the same experience? One comes out devastated by it, the other one becomes ennobled, becomes a more caring, compassionate, humane person. And I think that after being in the Marine Corps for 8 years, doing what I was doing, having seen combat, I wanted to do more. I said to myself, it's very easy to take lives and break things. I think it would be more challenging and a lot more rewarding if I could save lives and fix things. I went to school, I went to ECU, this was in 1988, and I was studying psychology because I wanted to be able to predict and understand and control behavior, modify behavior, do something along those lines. And I wasn't doing very well. I was feeling like, I was very disappointed. I felt like I would learn more by going to school and studying psychology, human behavior, and whatnot. And I was really thinking about just going back into the Marine Corps because I felt that's where I belonged. And there was a veteran there. He was a little bit further ahead of me in school, and he kind of just said, don't go back into the Marine Corps. I had those thoughts myself. I felt like that's where I belonged. I had no business studying, psychology and wanting to help people. But then I found out about a program called the Vet Centers, and I didn't know anything about the Vet Centers. And he was telling me about how it was a place in the community that it was for veterans. It was a place where veterans could go and just kind of be themselves. They didn't have to pretend to be anybody other than who they were. That there were other veterans there who cared, they understood, they would listen to each other, they would support one another, they would organize themselves to do service-oriented things in the community, have fun. And I was kind of for that because I think when I was going to school, a lot of veterans just didn't self-identify. There wasn't really anybody I could turn to and just kind of use as a sounding board and kind of compare my experience with them and say, well, gee whiz, is this normal? I walked in there and there was all this memorabilia on the wall and there were people there, they were friendly, they called me by my first name and offered me coffee, and I just felt so comfortable. I felt like I belonged there. And working with the counselors, working with the volunteers there, they would ask me, well, what is it that you would really like to do in life? And I would say, I want to help people. I think that's really important. I want to work with veterans, people who are wounded physically, psychologically, in the soul, help them to recover and heal and move on. And they pointed me in the right direction. They said, well, have you considered becoming a social worker? Well, I had studied psychology, I'd studied sociology, and I nearly didn't know that much about social work. But to me, it was the perfect balance. It was the perfect balance between kind of like the theoretical and the practical, where you're putting what you learn into practice, meeting people where they're at, rolling up your sleeves, getting down with them, really relating to them, advocating for them. And that's kind of like where I found my passion. And I was very lucky. I was very blessed. I was accepted to graduate school at ECU. I was hired right out of school to work for the Department of Veterans Affairs VA Medical Center in Durham in their post-traumatic stress disorder clinical team. I felt so lucky at that time. There was a recession going on. And I did that sort of work as an outpatient for about 3.5 years. And it was a crack team. It was a wonderful team. We had a full-time psychologist, full-time psychiatrist, full-time social worker. We had technicians. We had support. And it was at a time when a lot of the Vietnam combat vets were going through their midlife transition. And I didn't realize that at that time they were especially hot to handle. But having gone through the vet center and seeing them and working with them and having worked with a lot of Vietnam combat vets while active duty in the Marine Corps, I felt like I could relate to them. I looked at them as like older brothers. And at the same time, I was working with Korean War vets. Well, I knew a lot about Korea from my stepfather, so I was kind of interested in helping them because we called Korea the Forgotten War. A lot of folks remembered World War II, a lot of folks remembered Vietnam, but the Korean War vets, well, nobody kind of knew about what they were going through. And they lost a lot of good men over there in a shorter amount of time. And of course, the World War II vets. And being involved in these different cohorts, the World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and then came the Gulf War, and then the Second Gulf War. And I started to notice patterns. I started to notice, well, trauma, it derails folks. It is an overdose of reality. It's something that people have a hard time processing. And that the best way to go about dealing with it is through time, tears, and talk, these traditional methods. Now, there are folks out there who need more than that. They're going to need some form of medication. If you have something that's more than mild and moderate, something that's very severe, you might want to go ahead and think about working with a psychiatrist who can prescribe something to kind of take the edge off. Because I think it's really important that as you solve these problems, that you be able to do it with a certain amount of anxiety and arousal to keep your interest, but not too much to where you lose your motivation. And in 2000, one of my colleagues, who was a Vietnam combat vet, took his life. And I didn't see it coming. I don't think anybody saw it coming. We felt that he was very happy with where he was at life, that he enjoyed doing what he did, and wasn't depressed, wasn't suicidal, didn't exhibit any signs of wanting to die. And we all kind of wondered about it. Well, how did we miss this? How did we not see the signs? And we started to talk amongst ourselves, and then we started to realize that there were certain things going on in his life, these dots, that we weren't able to put together. And through this process, we felt like there was something more we all could have done at that time to prevent suicides. So I got very sensitized to that. And when other vets would come in, I would often say, I can make an angry person happy, but I can't raise the dead. So if you're having thoughts of killing yourself, I need to know that. So I think just at an unconscious level, I got more aware of suicide prevention, and especially suicide amongst Vietnam combat veterans. And then in 2007, there was some reporting in the news, some investigative reporting about high rates of suicide amongst active duty soldiers and veterans. And it really opened my eyes, and I think it opened eyes for just the American people, that this is a public health disaster. I mean, when you lose a veteran to suicide, losing a soldier in war, the whole nation grieves. This has been quite an experience the last almost 10 years, doing suicide prevention full time. It has been transformative. It really made me question a lot of the things about who we are and why we are here. And I can tell you, it added years to my life. When you're working with people who are trying to end their lives, I think for the person who's working with them, you want to add years to your life. So I became very health conscious. I became very much, watching my weight, exercising, getting plenty of rest, managing my stress, spiritual development, working in the community, doing everything I possibly can to be a good role model for folks who are thinking about dying by suicide. And I think it's important. I think it's important that we all be good role models. My senior drill instructor was a most excellent role model for me. He kept me alive in the military. He kept me alive in combat. I kind of questioned his methods, but now they make perfectly good sense now. The counselor in the vet center, he was a good role model for me because I didn't know what it was like to be a veteran. If you would have asked me in 1988, Gary, are you a veteran? I would have said no, because I did not see myself as a veteran. I thought of veterans as these old guys who would be at the American Legion or the VFW Hall, and they'd be, eating pizza and playing poker and telling stories like that. But if you would have asked me, had I been in the military? I said, oh yeah, I was in the military. I was in the Marine Corps for 8 years. Well, then you're a veteran. Oh, okay, that makes sense. So I had to work on my identity. I had to kind of rebuild my identity because there was no going back to being a civilian. That was just not an option, especially having been to war and that sort of thing, and getting an expeditionary medal. So I had to find my place. Thank God for the Vet Center. Thank God for the Department of Veterans Affairs. I feel very comfortable there. I feel like I could relate to my colleagues and to my clients. The structure of the VA is very similar to the military. A lot of veterans could relate to a nice formal structure, strong lines of accountability and responsibility and transparency. So I guess maybe that's how I got to where I am today. And I can tell you that I've never been happier. I've never been healthier. I am in complete peace with myself. I'm looking forward to at least another 15 years doing everything I possibly can to save as many lives as I can from suicide. But it's not me. It's not me. It's working with the community. It's working with UNCTV, which I am so proud that you are one of our community partners. And every time I meet you and your staff, I tell you that this is something that I would be willing to not only fight for, this would be something I would be willing to die for. I can't say enough about you. So I just want to thank you.
Thank you. A lot of people hear about veteran suicide issue.
Mm-hmm.
They don't really understand how severe of an issue this is, how many soldiers and how many veterans are committing suicide on a daily basis.
Yes.
How big of an impact really is this?
Well, as a survivor of suicide, I could say that one is too many. And when I say survivor of suicide, that doesn't mean that I've made an attempt to die by suicide. It means that I have lost loved ones to suicide. I have lost family members to suicide. I've lost fellow Marines to suicide, a colleague to suicide. I may have lost a client to suicide. I don't know. To the best of my knowledge, I've never lost a client to suicide. I felt that our relationship was strong enough, solid enough, that if he or she were contemplating suicide, they would let me know about it, knowing that I would do something to kind of trip them up and stop them. But I figure if I do this long enough, it's probably bound to happen, and I'll cross that bridge when I get there. But to me, one suicide is too many. It's sad because I think it's preventable in most cases. And it leaves people who are left wondering why. Why didn't this person who I love so deeply, who I cared about so much, come up to me and say, look, I'm having thoughts of killing myself and I don't know what to do. And by reaching out into the community and working with citizens, lay people, I think we can educate people and say, you know, there's something that I can do that would assist this person. It may be just listening to them very deeply. It may be offering them some really good advice and ideas on how they might be able to overcome these struggles. I mean, we've all had life experiences. Sometimes people, they can just use some words of encouragement. Say, I know how you feel. I felt that way myself. And I had those thoughts. I didn't act on them. But this is something that I did that helped me, and whatever that something was. And if it gets to the point where it's like life and death, then I think professionals need to be involved. I think we all have to kind of stay in our own lane and just recognize there's a time to see the doctor and to facilitate that.
I know with veterans, you bring in PTSD issues. You know, a lot of people don't understand PTSD is not regulated to the military.
It's not.
General people can have that.
Yes.
But you also have people who are survivor's guilt from the military. You have a lot of multiple aspects that come into this that are causing these feelings and causing these emotions and leading to this epidemic that we have right now. How can regular citizen recognize their veteran family member or veteran friend? What are some of the things that they can do to recognize that they need some help, that they might need to be guided to the right direction?
I know this is going to sound corny, but there was a recent study looking into people who are happy. And it's almost universal that people who are happy feel loved, and these relationships, these loving relationships, make us feel like we're important, that we're needed, that if we don't show up, we'll be missed. And I think we got to be fully present with each other. We have to listen to each other. We have to care for each other. We have to make time for each other. So this way, if something's not right, we'll see it in our friend, we'll see it in our loved one, and we can call them on that. They can say, well, lately I've noticed that you've not been yourself. Really? Yeah, you seem to be more down in the dumps than normally. What's going on? And then you can have that conversation going. And this way, you can do something about it way before thoughts of suicide come into play. The whole idea of preventing something is it's a lot easier to kind of blow out a match than to put out a forest fire. So to keep the fire from starting in the first place. So what I would like to do, my dream, my desire is to move this upstream, to get it to the point where people are doing things on a daily basis that keep them very healthy, keep them very happy, keep them very connected, keep them involved. So they never get to that point where there's no support. They're feeling all alone. They're feeling misunderstood. They see no other solution to this problem other than dying by suicide. And I just might want to kind of just throw this in there. When I give like a community presentation, I'm trying to educate the public to understand a very complex dynamic, like you described. Well, there's a spiritual component, and there's a physical component, and there's a psychological component, and there's a social component. And it all kind of comes together, and you get this horrible Rubik's Cube, and every time you solve it, you just kind of like make it worse. And then you get really frustrated, then you just throw it and that sort of stuff. But then you might find somebody who's good at the Rubik's Cube, and then they'll tell you the secret, and that's it? Really? Like, wow. And then you'll be like, doing them yourselves. So I think it's just really important to find somebody with a similar experience, somebody who understands, somebody who cares, somebody to mentor you. And when I think of a mentor, I think of like a combination of mom and dad, It's like they're both of your parents all in one. And they can assist you and just kind of coach you and just be there to support you. Friends, you know, friends, they're priceless. I mean, I'm going to go on a hike with a friend tomorrow. I've been looking forward all week. I'm sure he's been looking forward to it all week as well. We both have very stressful jobs. We're going to be hiking in the woods. We're going to be talking about our week. We'll be decompressing. We'll be telling jokes. We'll be laughing. We'll be talking about things that we're going to be doing. So I think it's just important to stay connected. And if you are feeling isolated, get out of that. Go to where people are at. When I'll sit down and do a safety plan with somebody who's contemplating suicide, I said, if you are having those thoughts and you can't do something by yourself to neutralize those thoughts, get out into public. Go to a library, go to a coffee shop, go to the mall, go anywhere, go to the park. Just see people interacting with each other is very therapeutic. And if that doesn't work, then it's time to call your Lifeline. Who is that one person that you can call at 3 o'clock in the morning and they'll talk to you? They're not going to hang up and say, look, I don't have time for this or whatever. And if you don't have somebody like that, you need to find someone like that. Find a friend. You know, get out there, do some networking, and just keep it up. And then, of course, you're going to have to maybe repay that favor because it kind of goes both ways, that exchange. And if for whatever reason that person's not available at 3 o'clock in the morning to talk to you, we have the Veterans Crisis Line. So that is kind of like a fail-safe. So if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and there's really nobody you can talk to, you can call the Veterans Crisis Line, and there will be somebody there. There will be a responder there, and he or she will talk with you and make sure that you're safe. And one of the examples I will use is your Vietnam combat vet who has that really bad nightmare. They don't want to disturb the family. They don't want to bother their friends, but they want to process it. They want to talk about it. Call the crisis line. Tell them what's going on with you. They'll listen to you to the point where you can maybe calm it down and go back to sleep. Because I think for a lot of vets who have nightmares, they're afraid to go back to sleep because they think that maybe that nightmare will pick up where it left off, and then what? And again, I mentioned earlier, sleep, rest, recreating yourself, having fun, getting some outlet out there, being creative. These are things we can all do. And, you know, yeah, we have professionals, but we want to kind of just keep them in reserve. We want to exhaust all the things that we can do by ourselves, with our loved ones, with people who care about us, to deal with life on life's terms. Now, one of the things I've kind of learned over the years is that suffering is the glue that keeps all of us together. Everybody suffers. Every living creature suffers. And I think that because we suffer, we reach out and connect with each other and support one another, and we look out for each other. I don't even want to see a world where there are people who don't suffer. I don't think they would talk to each other. I don't think they would have anything to do with each other. I think it would be a horrible thing. As bad as suffering is, you know, no suffering, that could be worse. But then again, we don't want people who are suffering to the point where they're thinking, oh, you know, I'm better off dead. So we got to have that not too much, not too little level of discomfort. I used to say to myself, the best sessions I've ever had with clients were the ones where I said very little or hardly anything. I let my client do most of the talking. And sometimes that's all we need to do. And for someone who's struggling, you might want to do what's called the 80-20 rule. They do 80% of the talking, you do, and you do 20% of the talking, you do most of the listening. And it's that power of the dialogue. It's that power of just really compassionate listening that is a powerful curative factor. I think we all have the answer to our problem. It's there. And it's, in part of therapy is just to kind of tease it out a little bit. And I believe in treatment. I believe in therapy. I'm not a masochist. I'm not into wasting my time. I'm not into futility. If I did not believe that treatment works, I would be doing something else. but I know treatment works. I've seen recovery. I've seen lives transformed and people becoming much more than they ever imagined they could be, being around other positive role models. So, you know, we can all do something. For those folks out there who feel like they're a burden to someone else, teach a child to read. Help somebody with their grocery shopping. Take someone to the store. Take them to their doctor's appointment. Volunteer. Because one of the things I've learned through my volunteer work is that how can I be feeling useless if I'm lightening somebody else's burden? It's actually quite good. It's mutually beneficial. So I tell folks to give it a shot. Do what you can. Stay involved.
Gary, thank you so much for the work you're doing with our veterans, trying to keep them on the good path here. Mm-hmm. And thank you for sharing today.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for giving me this opportunity. I appreciate that, and I appreciate what you do here. It is a wonderful community service, and I'm looking forward to helping you any way I can.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.